All right. Is Ralph Stevens here? Put your hand up. Are you here, Ralph? Oh, okay. Um, I wanted to ask if he was here because I was going to dedicate this program to his dad, Dr. Aaron Stevens, who was very close to us, longtime patron of the library and supporter of this series. So anyway, one more. March 22nd, Friday, 10 o'clock, we will be doing the Battle of the Bulge or the Ardennes Offensive. So hope you can make it for that. If you've been searching around for a good World War II book, you don't have to go very far. You just go down that aisle down there to the 940s, 54. That presumes that you have a library card. If you don't, see those ladies in the back. So I'm going to plug my display two more times. Up front, we have some military models that are brought in that you would have seen at in the Guadalcanal campaign and the Battle of Bulge. So go up and see that. And I guess I forgot the last time to tell you that those of you longtime followers of this series, there is embedded somewhere in the program a pop quiz. But the bonus for you today is that there's going to be a second pop quiz. And the bonus even beyond that, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to mix something up. I'm going to go back, since I know I'm not going to feed back if I move out there. I'm going to come and pick somebody out of the audience and put you on the spot. So you can think about that. All right. It's time for the thanks. Danny just went in his office. He is our IT manager. He goes a long way in making sure all of this happens. Danny, put your hand up. Say hi to Danny. We also have Ariana, who is up at the East desk today. She helps me quite a bit with these slides so they don't look quite so goofy up there. Derek, our building manager in the back. Put your hand up, Derek. And Ozzy, who is not here yet. So we are going to get started. Okay. And I have to start off actually with an apology about this because the last time I did this, I think it was back in 2015. It wasn't such a great program, but what I wanted to tell you is that this campaign, you can actually, Roy? Oh, that's right. Are there any first timers here today? Put your hand up. Oh, I'm sorry. Geez. My name is Dwayne Schaefer, and I am your host for this ongoing World War II series. Thanks, Roy. I completely forgot where it was. Yes. We could actually break this up into 3 or 4 separate presentations. So I'm going to ask for your patience. If I don't mention a ship that was there, if I don't mention a particular person who was there, it was not on purpose. But all right, we're going to get started, and we're going to start off with a segue. Okay. Oh, that's the wrong one. All right, we're going to start off with a segue. You've probably never seen this guy before, but Kazu Sakamaki, he was one of 5 midget submarine commanders that came to Pearl Harbor. The distinction about him is he actually got into the harbor because the nets were down. He got into the harbor, but lucky for our guys, the 2 torpedoes that were strapped to the side, he fired them, but they both missed. But his submarine ended up running aground, and he was captured. He was considered to be the very first prisoner taken in World War II. And he read about the Japanese victory at Midway. What's wrong with that? However, He was on his way to a POW camp in Tennessee, and in his transit to that POW camp, he saw all kinds of factories, all kinds of business, all kinds of commerce, and he knew that it would probably be only a matter of time until the Japanese were defeated. But what I wanted to do is give you just a very quick background of where we were in January, February, March of 1942. Granted, we did a couple of pinprick raids with our carriers. However, the morale in the United States was pretty bad until one very important thing happened, and that was Doolittle's raid in April 1942. Caused almost no damage, but it put the Japanese on notice that we could get to them. It was a big, big morale boost because all of the news from Europe, from Russia, was bad. You had Rommel almost to the gates of Egypt. You had the German Panzer juggernaut almost to the outskirts of Moscow. So a lot of the news was bad there. But the news was very good after Midway. And it was telling people that, yes, we may actually be able to win this battle. But at the home front, there were some interesting things going on. Did you know that there was no cars manufactured after Pearl Harbor until the end of the war? All of those materials were taken up in war manufacturing. And I'm going to talk to women for a second because you're really going to enjoy this. All the nylon was being confiscated for the war effort. So what did women do? When they would go out to dance or to a restaurant, they would paint their legs the color of the stocking. But even beyond that, to be a little more alluring, they would paint a line up the back of the leg. So farm labor was very hard to come by because a lot of the men were going off to war. So what did people start doing in their backyard? Somebody put up your hand. What did they do in their backyard? Victory garden. That's right. That's right. They were doing that. And of course, there was rationing, oil, gas, and all of that. But the morale was getting better. And our poor guy here was going to spend the rest of the war in Tennessee. Okay, we're going to orient you here. We've got the map up there, but we also have the map over here, and I apologize if it's down too low. You asked me the question about what was the crux of this whole campaign. Australia. And if you can see this map, you can see where Australia is. You can also see where the Solomon Islands are, right there, midway between Hawaii and Australia. And you can also see that up here. The furthest southeast advance of the Japanese Empire was all the way down here in the Solomons. So you can see why this could be worrisome. A B-17 overflew Guadalcanal at some point, and they saw Japanese engineers, Japanese construction workers. And what were they doing? They were building an airfield right there. Now, what does that mean? It means that if the Japanese could bring in air, land-based air, it would threaten that link between Hawaii and Australia. Had that been done, they had designs on New Guinea, Port Moresby, and who knows, maybe even Australia after that. Now we're going to home in a little bit more. You see the Solomon Islands. Rabaul, right up here. Huge, huge Japanese base. And you can see that as we go along from Rabaul, The Japanese will be able to bring in resources and come all the way down through here, through what was called the slot, and land their resources, their soldiers, their equipment, their planes. So we had to do something about that. So why Guadalcanal? I just explained pretty much. Once those two areas were under Japanese control, they could sever the communication between Australia and Hawaii. This would result in a direct threat to Australia and would leave them potentially open to invasion. The Solomons were the extreme edge of the Japanese empire, as I showed you. And once it was discovered that there was an airfield being built there, the decision was made. Okay, I have dissension at the top. Now, any of you that have read any of the history of this time knows that, and it didn't even need to be an Army-Navy football game, there was extreme animosity between the Navy and the Army, the Navy being represented by Chester Nimitz, the Army being represented by Douglas MacArthur. And yes, he did smoke a corncob pipe that big. They disagreed with a lot of things, and the primary area of friction was the allocation of resources. Of course, MacArthur, who got kicked out of the Philippines, he wanted to go straight back there with all the resources we had. Nimitz thought that it would be better if we did an island hopping campaign, sort of gnawing away at the Japanese empire. MacArthur wanted to go back, of course, and he didn't like the idea of a Navy man overseeing Army resources. But in the end, he was overruled, and Operation Watchtower came to be. Now, here we're going to look at some of our commanders. Major General Alex Vandegrift, nicknamed Sonny Jim, or don't know why. He was in charge of the 1st Marine Division. He felt that once the Marines were ashore, they should be under his command and not the Navy. On the right, we have Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, hero of Midway. He was in charge of Task Force 61. He said he could keep his carriers in the invasion area for only 48 hours. Because why? Because of the intense, incredible resources that the Japanese had in that area. He eventually broke down and said, okay, 72 hours, I'll stay with his carrier group. When things started to get hot, he left after 48 hours. And I'll tell you in a little bit why that was a problem. In the upper left, we have Admiral Kelly Turner. He planned out Operation Watchtower, which was alternately called Operation Shoestrings, but then by some of the guys who had to actually fight, it was called Operation Pestilence, as you'll see. He was in charge of the amphibious force. The landing force was under Vandegrift, as we said, and the screening group would be under Admiral Crutchley, the Royal Navy. But once Fletcher pulled out, Turner then said, I'm going to go too because I don't want all these ships to be sunk. So you could see the scenario that's going to come about. Those Marines that were landed on Guadalcanal are going to be stranded with whatever they had, whatever they were able to take off the ships. This guy, Robert Gormley, he was always a very, very vocal opponent of Watchtower. He didn't think it would work. He thought it would end in disaster. But the landing, it was going to take place on August 7th. Now, he was somewhat disconnected because he was at a command post in Noumea in New Caledonia, 1,300 miles away. And you'll find out what happens to him later. Okay, here's our Japanese commanders, of course, Admiral Yamamoto. He was in charge of the combined fleet. General Hadochiki of the 17th Army. He was in charge of that. He was basically a brilliant commander, but not flexible, not adaptable. And that is not a good trait to have. in the midst of a battle. We have Vice Admiral Mikawa. He commanded the 8th Fleet in the South Pacific. It was based at Rabaul, see, that place I told you that was way up on the map. And on the night of 8th and 9th, 1942, August, he commanded a heavy force of cruisers plus 1 destroyer and handed the United States a crushing defeat. So we begin August 7th, the Marines land on Guadalcanal, but that was actually not even the biggest part of the plan. Tulagi had a seaplane base that they needed to eliminate before we could really get underway in Guadalcanal. Remember, all that was at Guadalcanal was a bunch of engineers and a few troops, not very many. But they had to get to that seaplane base because they could harass any of the invasion craft that were unloading them. On August 8th, of course, the Japanese, Yamamoto found out about the landings. He sent down quite a few aircraft, Mitsubishi Bettys armed with torpedoes, Zero escorting attack fighters looking for the carriers. They weren't found because Fletcher was still off and away a little bit. And you were going to attack the landing and supply ships. None of the torpedo attacks were successful that day. And what I wanted to show you on the right-hand side, those are some Japanese sidearms. And I think I might have mentioned this in a previous program. But the Japanese were so cheap, they made their officers buy their own weapons, which is kind of weird. Okay, we're going to back up here even more to the landings on August 7th. You have the raider companies attacking Tulagi, the airbase, and several other areas too. Believe it or not, these areas on the Florida island and these little tiny islands here were much better defended than here around what would be known as Henderson Field. And they were able to, oh, this is going to be the next one. This is what it would look like in the Army landing craft. I'm sorry, the Marine landing craft going in. The Tulagi, okay, there are the different companies, A, C, D, and D. When they first landed, there was nothing there, but then one company went off to there was no Japanese there, and then they started making their way down here. They were making good progress. They started to meet some resistance here along Hill 208, and they finally got down to here, and there was extremely hard fighting. And you can see that is where the seaplane base was, right here on the bottom. They did eventually take that over, so the landings would be at least unmolested from anything flying out of Tulagi. Here's a picture taken from the USS Saratoga in August 42, and the runway doesn't really look like much right there because it wasn't quite finished. But what happened when our troops landed there, all of the Japanese engineers and whatever troops there were there, they fled inland. Now, we're not talking about thousands of people. We're talking about maybe a couple hundred, because they were not expecting a landing on Guadalcanal. And this goes to the heart of a lot of the Japanese philosophy. They didn't think we were capable. They thought we were lazy. They thought we were uninventive, unimaginative. They underestimated us at just about every turn. Here's some U.S. weapons right here. But on the 9th, the airfield was taken due to the threat of enemy torpedo bombers. The United States air cover and most of the rest of our Navy pulled out because Fletcher did not want to risk his carriers. Now, there's some logic to that, but it's also going to put the Marines on Guadalcanal at extreme amount of risk. And on the 12th, the Seabees, with their tractors and their equipment, they arrive on Guadalcanal and they complete the airfield just about, I want to say, August 20th. Now, there's some minor air attacks at this time. And the Japanese knew they didn't have enough aircraft right there to do the job. They didn't even notice that work was being performed on the airfields because all of our guys, all of our Seabees were using Japanese equipment that was already there. The mainstay in not only in Europe, but also in the Pacific theater was the M1 Garand, the 30-06 caliber. But the real heavy stuff is on your right there. The Browning automatic rifle, you can see it's got a big honking magazine right in there. And it is 30-06 as well. Now, we talked briefly about it. Admiral Mikawa, he sends a force down through the slot to Savile Island. If you remember well, it's not on there, but you remember the map, we had the slot going down there. Savile Island sits right at the top of that slot. So there's no way anybody can miss that. He sends his force down there and hands us a very, very serious defeat. The transports are forced to leave ours before they could be unloaded. We lost, or the Allies lost, over 1,000 men killed. We lost 4 heavy cruisers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, and 2 destroyers damaged. The Japanese casualties were very light. And why would you say that that is the case? The Japanese were masters at the night attack on the water. We were still basically learning that, but as you'll see, we were very good students, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Here's a couple of the planes. On the 20th, Henderson Field is completed, and they immediately start bringing in Grumman Wildcats and Douglas Dauntlesses. They are flying in from the USS aircraft carrier, Long Island. On the 21st, the series, this is where things really start to pick up. The Japanese go through daily raids, usually between 11 and 1,400 hours, trying to close the airstrip and damage the reinforcement vessels that were sent. After a while, that would be known as the Tokyo Express, because the Japanese were not going to send full-size transports down that slot. They were going to send a lot of fast destroyers coming down, carrying supplies, carrying troops, and they called that the Tokyo Express. On top, we have the Cape that could be either a torpedo bomber or a dive bomber, and we have the Val, which was a dive bomber. Both of those are carrier-based planes, which we have seen, we have talked about before. And why was the field named Henderson? Anybody know?
Airman killed. Yes.
Yes, there was an airman that was killed at Midway Lofton, Henderson, so they named the airfield after him. And here's an old friend that we see in just about every program we do on the Pacific. The Mitsubishi Zero has 2 20mm cannons, 2 7.7mm machine guns, very fast, very maneuverable, but very vulnerable, as you have heard in the past. And why is that? Because the pilot was given no armor protection back here. The fuel tanks in the wings were not self-sealing, so one hit on one of those wings and boom, it would go up. But here again, the Japanese were not used to Americans. They were used to flying against the Chinese in the Chinese War. And a story that I've told before in a couple of my programs, when the Chinese Air Force would meet anybody in the Japanese Air Force, even if they saw them coming from a distance, they'd bail out, wouldn't even engage. So this is what the Japanese pilots were used to. They didn't quite know what to deal with when they came up against the Americans. Now, the Wildcat fighter was good. It was not great, but it was good. It had characteristics like it could outdive. It had very, very powerful machine guns in its wings. I'm getting ahead of myself here. There's the Wildcat right there. A honking big 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine, and one of the main fighters that were shipped to Henderson Field. And I think I might have mentioned about a Wildcat before, that one of the people that were talking about it said, If you can get away from a zero, you've won your battle. And a couple of the other planes we talked about, the Douglas Dauntless was our Naval Scout plane and dive bomber. Through 40 to 44, they were still using them in 44, but then it was brought on. What was brought on later was the Curtiss Helldiver, and some of the planes again that were brought to Henderson. The P-400. You don't hear much about the P-400, but it was a deviation of the P-39. And the saying was, "Oh, give me a P-39 with the engine out behind." Now, why would they say that? Because the engine was back here in the middle. Now, you engineers, think about that for a second. The propeller shaft went all the way through here out to the front where the propeller was. But it was very, very good in the right hands. And an airplane is really only as good as the pilot that's flying it. And here's a scene that's going to take place countless times throughout the Pacific War. And what we were finding out that the Japanese were a different kind of enemy. These were guys that were not going to just give up or surrender. They were going to fight to the death on just about every one of these islands. And this is how it was going to be. They were going to go down into the places where they were hiding, because if they didn't do that, and the story comes from Okinawa and Iwo Jima, they would be in these holes. The GIs and the Marines would pass, they would pop up behind them, and boom, they would hit them. The GIs and the Marines became very suspicious after a while if they saw a Japanese soldier going like this, right? I'm surrendering. And he pulls a grenade out from behind, click, and blows everybody up. Yeah, it's a new kind of war. All right, on the night of August 21st, there were two detachments that were sent to Guadalcanal. One was the Ichi detachment, and the other was the Kawagapi detachment. These were about the size of a battalion, and this is all that Yamamoto thought was going to be needed, because they didn't think that the landings that occurred on Guadalcanal were really that much. And it would only require two forces of 2,000 Japanese soldiers to defeat us. Well, again, a tactic that the Japanese would use quite often until we got used to it. And again, they used it quite effectively in China. They would have their samurai swords and they would come out screaming, "Ah!" like that. And they expect their enemy just like, "Oh, okay, just kill me." No, not Americans, no. They were combat veterans and they were used to the Chinese army, either just giving up or collapsing. They seriously underestimated the Americans. They thought that they could get through with what they called the sashin, the fighting spirit. And they didn't need anything else. Well, excuse me, against machine guns, you're going to need a little bit more than that. And I like to always include a newspaper. A dozen more Japanese warships damaged by the U.S. airmen. And that was August 27th. And sometimes they didn't quite get everything right. Here's the eyes of the fleet. On the 21st, 25th, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the Imperial Japanese Navy moves in to catch our carriers. The USS Enterprise and the Japanese Zukaku are damaged. The light carrier Rijo is sunk. On the 31st, the Saratoga is damaged by submarines. We were talking about submarines. The survivors of the air group sent to Guadalcanal as reinforcements. How many of you know what the Japanese word for Guadalcanal was? Anybody? I had to say this over and over and over again until I got it right. Guadalcanal is the name that the Japanese called Guadalcanal. And on September 17th, October 1st, they're building up air units on both sides. The Japanese beef up their 11th Fleet. And this is the thing that is overlooked a lot when you're studying the Guadalcanal campaign. Yeah, there was fighting on Guadalcanal, but there was a ton of naval action going on all the way through those 5 to 6 months. Now, I promised you I'd let you see this picture again. We started off with that. And I wanted to include this because here's a young Coast Guard signalman, Douglas Monroe. He was killed in action because a bunch of Marines got cornered on one part of the island. Guadalcanal, of course, being 95 miles long by 33 miles wide. So the Japanese were able to hide in a lot of places. And if you remember seeing the picture, the two things, the thing in the advantage of the Americans is they clung to the coast, if you remember, where the landings actually took place. They clung to the coast. They had Henderson Field. That was the crux of the whole thing, defending that airfield so we could fly planes in there. The Japanese didn't like that. They didn't want us doing that. But they made a mistake. They made a mistake in that they were sending troops all the way down into the ugly parts of the island. And at the beginning there, I don't think I mentioned it, but Jack London, the author, spent quite a bit of time in the Solomon Islands, and he said, if I were a king, the worst punishment I can inflict on my enemies is to send them to the Solomon Islands. And why was that? It was, and I mentioned it was an area of pestilence, white ants, alligators, crocodiles, malaria, scorpions, kind of a lot of the stuff we have here, but not a lot worse, believe me. And I'll tell you why also in a little bit. So he came in with the boats, and he was manning this bow gun right here, defending the Marines as they were being evacuated. He did not survive this engagement, and as he was dying, his last words were, "Did they all get off?" And the corpsman that was taking care of him said, "Yeah, we got them all off." There was about, I want to say maybe about 500 of the Marines that they had to get off of that stretch there. And there's a newspaper artist carrying a litter of a soldier. Quite a bit of that went on. And we mentioned about the Ichi detachment. Well, the Ichi detachment and the Kawaguchi detachments, they got slaughtered wholesale because, again, they were doing the whole thing. They were coming running out of the brush, and especially along Alligator Creek, which was right along the coast. They crossed that creek splashing and yelling and screaming and waving their swords, and they were cut down by the score. At the end of one of the battles, there's 800 Japanese dead in front of the Marine positions. Only 3 were left alive. But of these guys, they were going down to the coast, hoping to be evacuated. And this was the thing too. I mentioned the Tokyo Express. This was a nightly thing of the Japanese sending down barges, transports, destroyers to resupply the men. But guess what? After a while, we were intercepting just about all of them. So the Japanese were not going to get the same amount of supplies that they should have had everything gone through. So suddenly starvation becomes a very big factor. Of course, all of the wounded as well. And Admiral Yamamoto is getting these reports, and he's saying, geez, maybe it's time to be pulled out of here. Just let them have it. So he goes to the emperor and asks him, Emperor Hirohito, can we please just get out of here? The emperor says, no, you have to take this island. We have to uphold the honor of the Japanese. So Yamamoto is going to go back again with more supplies, more troops, more transports. And one of the battles here along, now this is a really, really big blow up. So what I have to do is orient you here. This is Point Cruz here. The Henderson Field is over here. So we have our guys coming up through here, and attacking the Japanese in the flank. Now, like I said, all of our troops are just in this area, all in here. And the Japanese are going to come up and attack, try to fool us one night in the Battle of Bloody Ridge, where, as I mentioned, they are all sweating it out down there in the jungle. And they are going to send troops up from the south to try to take Henderson Field. But what the Marines did, and they did this in Vietnam too, they set up listening posts at a perimeter, some sophisticated and some as crude as just having a wire with cans attached. Well, the Japanese come tromping through there and they're making all kinds of noise. So Edson and his raiders, they set up on the ridge and they're ready for the Japanese when they come. But here again, with the seesaw nature of this campaign, on the 13th, Admiral Carita, we didn't see his picture, but he's another very, very accomplished admiral. They come down with the two biggest battleships they have outside of the Yamato and Musashi, and for an hour and a half, they pound Henderson Field with 14-inch shells, the Haruna and the Congo. But they stay out of range of our artillery that we have on there. So they're able to do that. They go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, bombing that field, blowing up our planes, blowing up our fuel dumps, but they didn't get them all. And each one of those 14-inch shells weighs 1,400 pounds. The guys that were in their foxholes around Henderson Field just said they had their hands over their ears the whole time, and they were still half deaf after the bombardment. And this is a little bit what Henderson Field looked like. Again, we lost a lot of planes, but not all of them, but we still had the field. And we were able to fly in planes after all of the bomb craters were fixed. Now, there's a couple of guys I want to bring your attention to. One you may already know if you watched the series The Pacific, but Mitchell Page on the 26th, around about the same day as somebody else we're going to talk about. After 33 of his Marines were in his machine gun platoon were killed on the Battle of Guadalcanal, the platoon sergeant Page, he operated 4 machine guns simultaneously, single-handedly stopping an entire Japanese regiment, or one of those detachments that we talked about. He also led a bayonet charge afterwards, after all their ammunition was expended. He led a bayonet charge against the Japanese. It's usually them that's doing that to us. He died in 2003 at the age of 85. Now, I put this down here because this is one of the planes that was flown into Guadalcanal as well. The TBF Avenger, which was going to supersede the Devastator, which they lost a ton of those at Midway. We needed a new torpedo bomber, and this was going to be it. The buildup of air units on both sides, the Japanese were doing that. They opened up an airfield in Buna, which is not all the way up to Rabaul, about halfway down. On the 14th, 15th of October, major Japanese reinforcement convoy lands 5,000 people. Battleships, heavy cruisers, they're still bombing the airfield, destroying or damaging a whole bunch of our bombers. Now, the guy that you have probably heard about, well, I have to show you that because that's a picture of him. The guy you probably have heard about was John Basilone. Put your hand up if you heard of him. Yeah, everybody, because he was in the series The Pacific. And on the 24th, his unit came under attack by 3,000 soldiers using machine guns, mortars. A mortar I'll show you a picture of later. He commanded 2 sections of machine guns which fought for the next 2 days, and only Basson and 2 other Marines were left standing. As the battle went on, the ammunition became low. Despite their supply lines having been cut, he fought through hostile ground to resupply his gunners He moved an extra gun into position and maintained continual firing at the Japanese. He then repaired and manned another machine gun, holding the defensive line until relief arrived. Now, there's a scene that's in the Pacific that I'm not sure if it's completely accurate. It shows him holding that water-cooled 30 caliber machine gun with his hands. If you can imagine how hot that probably was at the time. In the series, he ended up having very, very severe burns. Now, what happened to Barcelona after Guadalcanal? He survived, and he went on a Bond tour in the United States. Unfortunately, he is redeployed, and he dies at Iwo Jima in February 1945. And here's a picture of him doing his thing on Bloody Ridge. Like I said, they were all set up. They were all waiting for the Japanese to attack, and attack they did. And when he was done with his ammunition, he took out his trusty 45 and started shooting with that. And here's a picture later of Major General Vandergrift, Colonel Edson, who was in charge of the Marine Raiders, Mitchell Page, who we already met, Barcelona, who we already met too. Now, as I was putting together this slide, I was wondering, and I'm not a big fan of this show, but doesn't this guy right here look like John Goodman? He really does, doesn't he? All right, we mentioned about Gormley before. He was not a big fan of this operation, and it was beginning to show because people were complaining in Guadalcanal, obviously, about the supplies, about the ammunition. So Nimitz is going to sack Gormley for this guy, who you've probably seen before. This is Bill Halsey. And when Nimitz handed him over this command, Halsey says, Jesus and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato I've ever been handed. And this is like really in his character, because when he took over, and in his outside of his office, he had a huge plaque that said, kill Japs, then kill more Japs. Well, the message was pretty clear, I'd say. So it was a very awkward time too, because Nimitz appointed Halsey. Halsey and Gormley were actually roommates at the Naval Academy. But because he wasn't getting the job done, Nimitz saw this and he put Halsey in command. And Halsey immediately contacted Vandergrift and said, I'm going to send you everything that you need. I'm not going to hold back anything. And this was really the turning of the tide in this battle. Also, when Vandergrift was removed, not because he wasn't doing a good job, but he was then handing over most of the fighting to the Army, to General Patch. And we showed you a couple of American weapons before, but here's a few more that we had. Here's that water-cooled 30 caliber machine gun. Can you imagine holding that in your hands after it's fired a couple hundred rounds? The M1 carbine, 30 caliber, the 45 caliber Thompson submachine gun. Of course, we met the BAR on the bottom. Okay, now it's nice that Danny has this set up. I can see like what the next slide's going to be. So it's going to be our pop quiz, but I don't want you to yell out, please. Put your hand up. Okay, who is this famous person and what happened to him during World War II? Now, you may know the first part of this question, but I'm going to guarantee you probably don't know the last part, nor are you even going to get the extra credit after that. But try to tell me, who is this? Put a hand up. Absolutely, it is Leslie Howard. And when we're done, come up here, so I'm going to give you a book. Okay, I brought enough this time. Okay, Leslie Howard, yes. And here's a famous scene from, he played the wooden-headed Ashley Wilkes, if you remember. Now, he was in Portugal, and if you know a little bit about the history there, Portugal, Lisbon, a hotbed of espionage of every side. He was in his DC-3 flying back to England. They were jumped by a squadron of Ju-88 dive bombers. and he was shot down over the Bay of Biscay. The plane was shot down, and everyone on board was lost. Here's the extra credit. Why did the German plane circle round and around and around the wreck, taking pictures? Yeah, I would be really shocked if you knew this. Now, this is not on the slide, but somebody else that was on that flight was very important too. Maybe not extremely, but it was one of Leslie Howard's publicists, whose name was John Churchley. Am I making any sense of it? Who actually really looked a lot like Winston Churchill. The Germans thought Winston Churchill was on this flight. So they're going around and around and around, taking pictures of it, making sure Churchill was dead. Look it up. Just look it up. I'm right. Okay, next. This is one of the 100mm cannons that the Japanese used to attack Henderson Field. It had a range of 20,000 yards, but towards the end of the campaign, like everything else, not enough food, not enough medicine, not enough ammunition. So they weren't able to fire a lot of those, but they did. And here's some more of the Japanese weapons here. And I told you about the mortar before. It's known by different names. This is it right here. I think they called it a knee mortar. I'm not sure because they put it up like this and then fire it. 50mm grenade launcher. The Nambu machine gun with a 30-round magazine. More machine guns in the Japanese hold. He holds an Ariska rifle, 7.7. Okay, here's another one of the maps. And as you can see, now we can really see a little bit better. Here's Henderson Field. But by October 19th, they built another airfield just for the fighters. So you can see things are really starting to move. And this is the American perimeter here. But the Japanese, they're still down here in the pestilence. And they come up and they attack. And they are decimated. October 26th, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Now, this is what I was saying. I mean, there was a bunch of different naval engagements that took place during this whole campaign. Each one could be one in itself. And the sea battle of Guadalcanal. We got a lot more damage, but we were able to spook the Japanese away from Henderson Field. One of the big Japanese battleships, the Haiti, suffered rudder damage and had to be sunk the next day. That night, our battleship task force engages another Japanese force, shelling Henderson, sinking another Japanese carrier. And something that, again, that's overlooked a lot in any presentation about the Guadalcanal campaign is the Coast Watchers. They were there before the war, and they stationed themselves along that upper coastline, and they had radios. So that very first Japanese air attack, we knew it was coming because the Coast Watchers saw it and said, 27 Betty bombers headed your way coming southeast. So any little bit of warning was really appreciated by these guys. And here is Sir Jacob Bouza, soon after the Allied landings at Guadalcanal. He was captured by the Japanese. And it's a miracle that this guy actually survived to warn the Allies. They bayoneted him, they shot him in both arms, shot him in both legs, but he survived and he was able to bring warning of an attack. Now, something you probably wouldn't imagine very much on Guadalcanal is tanks. I have one up there in my display, an M3 Stuart tank. And up until December, we really didn't use these that much because tanks are not ideal for jungle warfare. They're an open country weapon. But there was a particularly big Japanese strong point on Mount Austin, which is about 20 miles inland. This had to be taken out. So 3 of our Stuart tanks went up there. 2 broke down on the way, but this guy, he goes in with his 37mm cannon and he reduces a whole bunch of those. But Right at the end, the Japanese get very desperate. They all come running out of their holes with their guns, their bayonets, their swords, and they are cut down by small arms fire. Now, did the Japanese have tanks there too? Sure, they had a light tank. The special Type 2 Kami was an amphibious tank. Again, not used very much, very light, under 10 tons. The verdict, yeah, tanks of any kind weren't very good in jungle warfare because they could be swarmed from any point. And this is what the Japanese did to a couple of our tanks. And they didn't really have sophisticated weapons. They didn't have a lot of bazookas, so they got oil rags, yeah, Molotov cocktail, and took out a couple of our tanks that way. Here's a good picture showing some of the weaponry. He's holding a 30 caliber machine gun. Here's an example of three different things. There's a Thompson submachine gun there, a bazooka, and a Garand over there. All right, we're coming up almost to the end of the campaign. January 26th and 29th, the Japanese started withdrawing because, once again, Yamamoto went to the emperor, said, please, we can't stay. Our guys are dying from disease, starvation. And the emperor says, well, okay, you can start evacuating, but not before there is a few more battles right on, you remember I showed you Point Cruz here before. This is the upper west side of the island, right there. And yeah, the things are starting to, well, at least it's Betty Grable, right? I mean, you know, not some really, still gonna talk to her about this. Oh, here's our second pop quiz. No yelling, please, no yelling. Sean Penn played a very tough top sergeant in what classic war film? Put your hand up. Yes. Yes, very good. Come up at when we're done. I'll give you a book. Yep, there it is. Thin Red Line, book by James Jones, which was part of a trilogy as well. Now I put this picture in because this looks like that could have been one of those scenes from that movie. You know, when they're going up the hill and Nick Nolte's there, charge like that. So that's a good picture. That is an actual picture of the Marines going up. Iron Bottom Sound. It got its name because so many ships were sunk in that area right to the north of Guadalcanal itself. At the Battle of Tassafaronga, which is on the western side, we lost the battleship Northampton, and 3 other cruisers were heavily damaged to the loss of 1 Japanese destroyer. However, the other 7 destroyers that were bringing cargoes of food, medicine, remember I was telling you there was a Tokyo Express, boom, 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 like that, they turned back. So the Japanese soldiers are in a very bad way. January 12th, here's some more action by the Matacao River. And as you can see, the Japanese are being pushed further, further, and further away up to the southwest corner. And this is actually where they're going to be evacuated. Here's a picture of one of those transports beached that was probably sunk. And the statistics for this campaign, it depends on who you read. What I would tell you, and we're going to get to my sources, and I know I keep talking about Samuel Eliot Morison. He can tell you more than you ever wanted to know about the naval aspect of this campaign. And I highly recommend you get the book about that. February 43, this is the last Japanese infantry are being evacuated. They come and get them in 3 waves. Of the original 30,000 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal, 10,000 were actually evacuated. Well, so we kind of dropped the ball on this because guess what? We're going to see those guys again. We're going to see them probably at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. 10,000 were killed in battle and 10,000 died of disease and starvation. Wow. Okay, here's our final slide on the casualties. And what I didn't put in here is because I was doing research on this all the way up to the end. Of course, the Marines, the Army, they lost a lot of guys. But the Navy lost almost 3 times that number because of our ships that were sunk, the Australian ships that were sunk. That figure is going to be more like, where did I have it? Almost 5,000 naval personnel lost their lives and 12,000 suffered serious injuries. The Guadalcanal campaign was significant because it was a good test of combined arms. And what that is Navy, Army, artillery. You put all those things together, and air, of course. Had we not had that airfield, we would not have been able to keep Guadalcanal because the Japanese would have completely obliterated us. They had reached their high water mark. It marked the transition of the Allies from defensive operations, which we'd been doing all along until then, to offensive ones that would eventually mean the end of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And here are my sources right here. And again, I mentioned Samuel Eliot Morison. Make sure you pick that up. And I was sad that Dr. Stevens wasn't here today. His son is a doctor too. He gave me this book, and it had a wealth of information. It had the information about the ladies cleaning their legs. So I knew I had to include that. So we have the Osprey series, Guadalcanal, Evan Thomas, and John Tolan. And those are the sources that I used. And I don't think I left anything out. So that's the end. Questions? Remember, I had a golf club. Okay. I'm sorry? That was February 45. Yeah. Next.
I'm surprised to see 1,000 captured Japanese.
I was not going to go into a lot of gory details about this, but so many of their soldiers were completely prostrate. They couldn't move. In fact, they had poems that they wrote about this. They said, if you could do this, you were only 30 days away from death. And then 15, 10, and 1, and you were dead. Yeah, they couldn't move because they were starving to death. And they said some of these people that they were taking off were just skin and bones, and they could hardly move. So those were the ones that, we captured. None of the fighting men, because they were going to go down to the last man. Again, we would see that a lot later too. Yes, ma'am. That's a good question. I was going to include that. The Solomons were actually discovered by Spanish explorers in the 1500s, and it was I can't remember quite who owned that area before, but the Japanese just basically walked in at the beginning of the war and took that over, and they didn't realize that they were going to need an outpost then, but then as their holdings started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, they wanted a lot of the real estate on New Guinea. And in order to do that, they had to be able to fly assets there. So that's when the Australians started getting very nervous about all this, and us too, because as you see, Hawaii here, Australia here, the Solomons are right in the middle. Yes, sir.
One thing I read about Bromley that really annoyed Nimitz was he never went to Guadalcanal, and when Halsey took over, he immediately captured it. And Nimitz went there when the fighting was going on.
Yeah.
But Bromley was
No.
100 miles away.
No, and I don't know whether he was sulking or pouting or what, but like I say, from the very beginning, when they were doing the planning of this, he says, I want no part of this. He says, I don't think it's going to work. It's going to be a disaster. And yeah, it could very well have been a disaster because he was a smart, educated naval tactician. But he, like I say, he was sitting 1,300 miles away from the battle. You wouldn't see that with a George Patton or a Fletcher, who would be like right there, knowing what was going on. So Yeah, and after a while, the brass got tired of that, and that's why they put Halsey in there, because they knew Halsey was gonna get stuff done. Yeah,
Order to Chinese
mhm.
is that immediately preceding?
That was during the 30s.
In the late 30s?
Yes.
Okay, because I've been reading that from another book, this overlay that.
Hmm.
That there is sort of this works as
Mhm.
Chinese.
And the Japanese were in China in the beginning because they thought that the Russians were going to be coming down through Manchuria. So that's why the Japanese felt they needed to be up there. And there could have been, a major thing there, but then the Chinese started to get up these armies too, and then the Japanese had to deal with that. And the Japanese were brutal to the Chinese. They bombed their cities. The rape of Nanking. But like I say, the Japanese were used to a certain quality, a certain talent that the Chinese had, and they were used to that. But then when we came along, it was like a whole different ballgame.
Well, wasn't one of the reasons for invading China, again, on the material side, was that it was easy access for coal for the Japanese?
Yeah. Yeah, resources. That's what it was all about, because of the Japan is an island, and they have to import just about everything. And then when their war machines started getting into high gear, they needed more resources, and that's why they were going to go down into the Dutch East Indies to get oil, tin, rubber, and all those things that are very, very valuable to a war effort. There were, yes, in China, there was some manufactured incidents like the Muk Den incident that gave the Japanese the excuse, the casus belli, to go in and reduce the Chinese. But then, like I say, when we came along, it was all different. Yes, sir.
This is more of a generic question. You showed us MacArthur in the beginning. What's the organizational structure of Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force? The Marines under the Army?
No, they were under the Navy. They were under the Navy, and the Air Force, the Army Air Force, was under the Army.
So where was the sort of grunt Army soldier?
Well, what they did in the beginning, before things really started to heat up, they had a dividing line. And Admiral King and Marshall said, everything underneath this line, MacArthur's going to take care of. Everything above this line is going to be taken care of by Nimitz. But the problem with that is that the Solomons were actually still in MacArthur's hemisphere, if you want to call it. But then they changed that. That's why, another reason why he was very upset. Okay, if I don't see you again, be here March 22nd, please. We're going to wrap things up. Those of you who got booked, come on up. Oh, I'm sorry. Here, you have your choice. Since I've got 4 of them. No, he actually was.
Barely one of you.
Once again.